It's the week ending Saturday the 18th of April, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen President Trump halting American funding of the World Health Organization, the IMF calling for a Brexit trade talk extension, and Banksy revealing new artwork from lockdown. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is boss man Holden Frith and Arion McNicoll, and from the week junior, Felicity, Capon. And Arion, we're all recording remotely this week, but you are recording very remotely.
I am, yes. I came over to Australia for a bit of a holiday, and now it seems I'm a bit stuck in Australia.
It's just like being a teenager again.
It is. It's amazing. I'm back in my childhood room in my mother's house, and it's all very exciting in a 90s kind of way.
Good. Well, we're getting the vibe. You're actually up first this week. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
This week we discovered that money can't buy you love, but it can buy you the rest of the Beatles' back catalogue.
Hey Jude is Paul's. It's one of his masterpieces. I don't think I had anything to do with it. Ask him. I don't feel as though I had anything to do with it. He said it was written about Julian, my child. So he knew I was splitting with Sin and leaving Julian then. So he was talking on driving towards to visit me or Julian. I think it was just to see Julian to sort of say hi to him, because he'd been like an uncle. You know, he was always good with kids. And he'd come up with Hey Jude. But I always heard it as a song to me.
The late, great John Lennon there talking to David Sheff in 1980. But what is the story this week, Arion?
So the story this week is that Paul McCartney's handwritten lyrics to the song that John Lennon was just discussing, Hey Jude, sold at auction for a pretty staggering $910,000, which was 9 times the original estimate for what it was going to sell for.
Blimey.
It was part of this broader auction of Beatles memorabilia that was put together to mark 50 years since the band's breakup. And it also included some other lots that sold for relatively eye-watering prices, including a stage that the band performed on in Liverpool before they were famous that sold for $25,000. And
wow, I saw a picture of that. I mean, it's literally 8 planks of wood.
Yeah, exactly. And then the next one that I thought was particularly interesting was this ashtray that Ringo Starr had used a few times that sold for $32,000. So there were just these ridiculous sums being thrown about. And it sort of it seems particularly interesting as a story for me because it comes against this backdrop of online auction houses reporting just huge amounts of extra activity in online sales, both bidding and actual purchasing, and also that there's this huge rise in not just pop memorabilia and Beatles stuff specifically, but collectible items generally. So it just sort of seems part of a broader pattern that's quite interesting.
And Felicity, I guess the reason that there are people looking for slightly more obscure investments is because, to state the obvious here, the stock market is not the most reliable place to put your money at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I mean, certainly it does seem that with so much uncertainty and, you know, potentially facing a huge recession and global downturn, people do want to find new alternative ways and things to do with their money that might go a little bit further than what we're looking down the barrel at now. But I think also, as Arion was alluding to, I think a lot of people are at home, they're bored. If they've got money, and in this case a lot of money, and they want to spend it, I mean, going on to an online auction is where you want to be. And it seems one of those things that has actually kind of migrated and translated to the online world quite successfully. Lion and Turnbull, an auction house in Edinburgh, they had a behind closed doors sale of decorative arts and design on April the 1st, and they recorded nearly 1,400 bidders, which was double those registered at an equivalent real life sale last October. And it meant that it did really well. Several items soared above their estimates, although I think it took 12 hours to complete, and there were 654 lots. But it is something that is generating a huge amount of interest, I suppose.
It's interesting you pick a kind of heritage brand there in terms of the auction house, because, I don't know, Holden, had you heard of Julian's Auctions before you read this story? I hadn't.
No.
And you kind of think, okay, how do you know, this isn't Sotheby's, how do you know what you're buying is real?
Yeah, and I think this gets, I suppose, into the broader point of investments in general and how much faith investors can have in the value of what they're buying now and the likelihood of whether it's going to hold that value and sustain it. But I wonder if part of the reason that people are more willing now to put their money into these sorts of online auction houses is websites like eBay, which have kind of trained us to use online auctions to trust people that we've never met and to have that faith that what we are buying is going to be what we expect, or if we don't, that there will be some kind of comeback for us.
I think there's also problems though. The fact that we are online and we do have eBay and we are kind of used to it is definitely helpful, but there are massive problems with the idea that everyone's online now, including fraudsters and people who are looking to trick you. And I think with the Lion and Turnbull auction, it certainly raised questions about, cybercrime and the fact that criminals will look to exploit the fact that huge amounts of money is being transferred online. And there was a case, I think it was last week, that kind of made the headlines of the Reich Museum transferring a huge amount of money to an account in Hong Kong. They thought they were buying a Constable painting, but they had actually transferred all the money to these fraudsters. So I suppose that's another thing that, in some ways we are slightly more used to the idea that you can get dodgy links and there are dodgy people online. But I suppose with all these online auctions of very valuable things moving online, is that going to attract more cybercrime? I think it almost certainly is.
And quite aside from that kind of switch and bait scam, Arion, there's the encryption, I guess, technology underlying a lot of these auction houses, which might come into question. I mean, we're having this conversation now via Zoom. There have been a lot of stories over the last few weeks of kind of, people gate crashing Zoom parties and exposing their bits and all this sort of thing. And people are, increasingly willing to just trust technology. But it's not just the product itself. What you've got there, of everyone watching that product, are people that have $100,000 upwards ready to spend on a piece of paper. I mean, that's valuable information to a criminal.
Yes, exactly. And I think that, it is not just the smaller auction houses like this, Julian's, which was a name that I hadn't heard of either, but it is the kind of the Sotheby's and so on who are seeing this massive boom in online sales. And they just had an auction last month of 20th century design objects that saw their highest amount of online sales ever. It is potentially troubling to think that those sorts of sales could be being watched and potentially intercepted.
And Holden, how reliable an investment do you think it actually is to put your money into 20th century pop music collectibles? Because it seems to me at this moment in time, obviously there are baby boomers still alive with money looking to invest it who love Elvis Presley and the Beatles and moving forward a bit ABBA and Queen and whoever, is seeing rising stock. But is that going to be the equivalent of a Picasso or a Matisse in 200 years' time? Or will people have forgotten who Paul McCartney was?
There's an equivalence between the memorabilia and the artwork, because in the case of the Beatles and their contemporaries, the artwork is the song, and we can all own that. It's sort of infinitely reproducible, and the lyrics. I think it's really hard to say what value they will hold, and I suppose we've been trained to think of all commodities as only being worth what somebody's willing to pay, but it does seem that something like pop music and the people who produce it are much more vulnerable to changing fashions and those sorts of questions. But I wonder how much of these sales are about investments and how much are actually about people who it's just kind of extended fandom, really. And if you think about the sort of demographics of people who have this sort of money to spend, it's probably a lot of people, mostly men in their 50s and 60s, who are in that core Beatles demographic. And so maybe this is actually less about thinking this is going to be a pension for them and more about just wanting to own something that has been touched by Paul McCartney, that's come from the pen of a Beatle.
I think as well, picking up on that point of the value of pop music in particular, I mean, the reason that a Degas or a Picasso or Matisse becomes valuable is partly because they enter the canon of the artists and artworks that are most familiar to people. And I think that of any possible collectible in the pop sphere, you'd probably have to say that the Beatles are most likely to be a name that's going to be recognised another 50 years or 100 years hence. So I'd say if the market is likely to hold, and probably there is some truth to that as long as there are people willing to pay for it because they just love the Beatles, then things are going to have value. Then you'd think that among that group of names, it would be the big bands that would hold their value better than others.
So if you actually hold something like this in your house, Arion, at the moment, and you're listening to this, is now the time to sell? Is it, any collectible, any 20th century collectible, is now the time to say, yes, this vintage Marilyn Monroe poster, you don't see many upsides to coronavirus, but is now the moment to think, if you want the money, do it now?
I ran that theory about the way that people look in times of stock market crisis to invest in alternative types of investment, which can be things like vintage cars or watches or artworks or things like pop memorabilia. I ran that past our resident financial guru, John Stepek, to get his view on whether that theory holds. And he said that actually the times that art in particular and memorabilia and alternative investments do best is kind of when there's a bubble of some kind. And he said that probably you're most likely to do well when a few individuals are sitting on an awful lot of money. That may be now. That, certainly there's plenty of billionaires out there, so it could be the time to try to flog off your old Ringo Starr ashtrays. But no, I think that it really does depend on, as I think Holden was saying, there being buyers out there who have the money to spend, and they could be the anoraks. So really, you're looking for the time when people are at a peak of fervour for a particular thing, and that may be something like now, 50 years since the breakup of the Beatles. Sell your memorabilia because they're on people's minds.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't use ashtrays during our recordings, obviously, but if you all hold on to the costumes you were wearing in the cover art, who knows? In 50 years' time, that may have great value to your grandchildren's generation. Felicity, you're up next after this. A quick content warning now. Our next story includes a discussion and description of domestic violence. Do check the show notes for more details on that. Felicity, it's your story. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
This is the week we learnt that home is often where the hurt is.
He sat me in the police car and he said, right, we're not leaving it until you tell me the truth. And I still said, no, I'm doing this all to myself.
I turned my camera off and I said to him, look, my camera's off, it's just you and me in this car.
Straight away I just said it, and I said, please go on what the neighbours have said, because I don't want to say that it's come from me.
He just quite calmly said to me, yes, it was her.
BBC Three's Abused by My Girlfriend, the teenage romance that descended into terrible violence, available online. Felicity, what's the story this week?
The story this week is that figures from the Metropolitan Police have shown that domestic abuse offences committed by sisters have doubled from 641 in 2010 to 1,325 in 2018. So it's a story about women and girl abuse on other family members, which is a story that I suppose when it comes to domestic abuse is often overlooked. The numbers have quadrupled for stepsisters and half-sisters from 33 to 142. And female perpetrators now account for 28% of cases. That's up from 19% a decade ago. Ex-boyfriends, boyfriends and husbands are still the overwhelming majority of perpetrators of domestic abuse. But this is an angle that sort of rarely gets looked at.
Yeah, and as ever with domestic violence statistics, I suppose the question you have to slightly cynically have in the back of your mind is, have instances really gone up, which is obviously a bad thing, to talk in crude terms, or is it that reporting's gone up, which actually, if the instances haven't necessarily gone up, can be seen as a good thing?
I think it's always good when there's more attention on these types of stories generally. And I do think the idea of sibling violence and sibling bullying rarely gets looked at. So I think any data that we have and any information that people are talking about or looking into is really important. I mean, I think I was reading somewhere that actually sibling maltreatment is the most common form of domestic abuse in Western society. And studies consistently show that between 1/3 and 1/2 of children under the age of 18 are involved in some kind of sibling bullying.
And perhaps part of the reason behind that, Arion, is because it's maybe harder for people to know where the line is, because it's natural to have disputes with your siblings, you know, a difficult relationship with your siblings, even when you're children, a bit of push and shove with your siblings in a way that we all understand now isn't acceptable within a marriage. People don't think of it as domestic violence when it escalates necessarily.
I think that's right. And I think because sibling violence is likely to start from a very young age in a relatively harmless way. You know, obviously little kids will shove each other and grab things off each other. And I think that probably establishes a precedent that means that it's hard for people to know sometimes when a line has been crossed. And I found similar stats to Felicity from a journal called Clinical Psychiatry News, which echoed that same thought, that sibling violence is the most common form of family violence. And it sort of speaks to this issue of reporting or the question of reporting. You know, are we now at a stage where we're just seeing more reports because people are realising that sibling-on-sibling violence isn't appropriate? Or is it that it's getting worse? And you could imagine that recognition of what violent behaviour constitutes becoming more apparent could actually be what's underpinning this statistical rise.
And also, I guess, Holden, the smashing of a taboo slightly, which is, I mean, we had for a long time men nervous to report domestic violence against them, although, as Felicity points out, obviously that's still the minority. Now it's kind of, I guess, a further taboo of, it's my sister. It's I've been hit by a girl and it's my sister, and that is domestic violence.
Yes, and I think there's a broader taboo even about domestic violence committed by women generally, and perhaps particularly committed by women against men. And there have been various studies done which have found that although it's a smaller portion of the overall picture on domestic violence, it's also much more likely to be underreported. There's a stigma about talking about it because it might seem to be downplaying the problem of domestic violence against women, but I think there's also a stigma for victims reporting it, perhaps because there is still a bit of shame attached to the idea, if you're a man, of having been attacked by a partner. That's a different sort of shame that attaches when the genders are reversed.
And Felicity, aside from the societal changes, what else is going on that's altered? I mean, technology springs to mind.
I'm not too sure, really. I think it's the fact that like Holden was saying, we're probably just more open to it and more willing to discuss it and for it to be reported. And I think these figures, they were from the Metropolitan Police, but it was the London Assembly who uncovered them, and it was a part of an investigation they were doing. So it certainly seems that it's something that is rising to the agenda more generally. And I think even though the figures that were looked at as part of this story were up until 2018, obviously it's a very pertinent story in the current lockdown context, as people are very, very worried about domestic abuse that's going on in homes, you know, around the world. And I think a strand to that is not just men on women violence. It is this idea that children who are at home and who are experiencing sibling violence will also now be more vulnerable, and for many of them who see school as a sanctuary and their teachers as kind of their saviours and people that they can go to get out of violent households, that's now not the case. And I just wonder, when it does come to sibling abuse and sibling bullying, whether right now children are able to access online information about this and the support and the help that they need. So I think under the lockdown context right now, the idea of actual children being vulnerable to abuse, as well as women and indeed men, to a lesser extent, you know, whether they are being able to seek the treatment that they can.
It seems a particularly difficult issue both to tackle in terms of detection and then any sort of treatment, particularly because obviously families are going to be among the most loath to report on one another's wrongdoings. And so, first of all, you've got that problem, that hurdle to get over. But secondly, to know what to do in the age of coronavirus or other times, is the only solution to severe sibling violence to be a separation of the two siblings in question, and how would that even work in practice? It just seems one of those very difficult problems to solve.
And actually, you mentioned the coronavirus there, and Felicity, this has been reported to the extent that it has been, partly in the context of the government having talked about domestic violence cases going up during lockdown and offering olive branches and saying, here's a hashtag, here's a number you can call, etc. Don't worry about self-isolation if you're in an abusive relationship and all that stuff. But are these statistics actually anything to do with the coronavirus, or do they predate the lockdown?
They do predate, so they go up to 2018, but we can only imagine that, if this is 2018, under lockdown, it must be an even bigger number and more people at risk than ever. So in some ways, it's an interesting indication of what could be going on right now. And I think there was one charity had reported 16 suspected domestic abuse killings in the UK since the lockdown restrictions were imposed, which is far higher than the average rate for this time of year. And also the idea that whatever's going on right now, for many victims, it just won't be safe to seek help right now or to report or go to the police now because they're experiencing it. So there's going to be a huge surge, I imagine, once lockdown is over, of victims actually going to the police and reporting it or seeking the help they need. So it's very, very difficult and murky to know actually right now what's going on.
And one incentive that I did see, Holden, I don't know if you spotted this as well, kind of going around social media as a message from the police, and various celebrities retweeted it too, was apparently if you call 999 and you're at the absolute apex of a domestic violence situation, if you press 55, that alerts the police to the fact that you can't talk at the moment, but leaves the mic running, or you can hang up the phone and they come to your house as a response, and they know it's a domestic violence incentive. I guess people trying to rise to that challenge at the moment, it can only be a good thing. Yeah,
I think everyone, and particularly emergency services at the moment, are trying to work in really difficult circumstances and just work out how we live in this world. And I think that there always has been the advice that if you are at risk of some sort of attack and you can't speak, then do just try and call 999, even if you only leave a silent call, because that at least leaves a trace that can be followed up. But yes, I wasn't aware of the tapping out 55 to give a bit more detail so that police will know what to expect when they arrive.
And Felicity, you were talking on the show earlier in the year about the domestic violence bill in the House of Commons and how that was, a welcome opportunity to tie up some of the loose ends around domestic violence law. Do you think after the coronavirus is finished, lockdown is over, some of this information needs to be fed into that act? And specifically with regard to sibling violence, which I haven't heard being spoken about before.
I like to think that we will see that. Having seen the domestic abuse bill, it has been frustrated, as you said, due to all sorts of things. But the fact that I think it is there and it sets a very strong framework and grounding for all the work we need to do now. I think the lockdown will hopefully only help that. I think in some ways the silver lining to this very, very dark story is the fact that it has been talked about pretty much since lockdown begun, that people were very, very concerned about it. I think the sibling issue is slightly more overlooked. I don't think people are talking about sibling violence and abuse so much. But again, hopefully that could be one good thing that comes out of lockdown, that along with the domestic abuse bill and all the work that's hopefully going to be good stuff that's going to come from that, you'll also see more of an emphasis on focus on kids who are in, really horrendous situations.
Yeah. And if you've been affected by this issue, there are numbers you can call for support. We've put them in the show notes to this week's episode. Holden, you're up next after this. So, Holden, you're finishing the show this week. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is it time for a truce between a prince and the king of beasts?
There is a place for commercial hunting in Africa, as there is around the world. It's not to everyone's cup of tea, but the argument for regulated, properly controlled commercial hunting is that the money that goes from shooting a very old, infirm animal goes back into the protection of the other species.
Prince William, the Duke of Cambridge, speaking to ITV News in 2016. Holden, what's happened this week?
This week, it's his brother, Prince Harry, in the spotlight, thanks to an interview in the Radio Times with Dr. Jane Goodall, a renowned primatologist and friend of the royal family. I don't know if there's an overlap between those interests, but asked if William and Harry were doing a good job as champions of the natural world. She replied, "Yes, except they hunt and shoot, but I think Harry will stop because Meghan doesn't like hunting, so I suspect it's over for him." To the extent this got...
And hence you sense a bonfire being lit.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, that element of it is what's got the attention, the idea that Meghan is stopping Harry doing something he wanted to do. But the reason I thought it was worth discussing here was really the question about whether hunting and conservation are incompatible, which Jane Goodall implies, or whether the prince has a right to say that one activity can support the other.
Well, the distinction that William and Harry have always made when I've seen them interviewed about hunting, and obviously they tend to want to be interviewed about clamping down on illegal hunting, and then a cheeky journalist will confront them with the fact that they do hunt recreationally. What I've seen them say is essentially there's a difference between legal and illegal hunting, and in the case of legal hunting, you can use it to manage populations. It can be an ethical thing to do in certain circumstances. Do you think Harry's had to change a heart on that?
I don't know. I mean, if he has, it's been relatively recent. There have been a good number of cases where either Prince William or Harry have been seen on a hunting trip. There's a case in 2014 where both of them went hunting in Spain, where they shot deer and wild boar, and then the next week William launched a campaign against the illegal wildlife trade. And of course, as you say, these are completely different activities, and drawing a comparison between them is flawed, but in terms of both PR for themselves and also the impact of the campaigns that they're trying to mount, I think it probably does have a slightly undermining effect.
Yeah, so if you were campaigning for road safety, it wouldn't be good to be seen darting around the track at Silverstone, Felicity.
I can see the distinction, but I think it also opens them up to accusations of, rank hypocrisy. And I think from a kind of PR point of view, it's just not the right look. And I think it's perfectly valid to criticise them for taking part in this pastime. But I think it's also to do with, the idea that you preach one thing to make you look like a good person, and then you go off and do your own shooting. It doesn't sit quite right. But having said that, I'm informed that Harry has missed several huntings actually recently. So the Royals' annual summer holiday hunt in Balmoral in 2018, he missed that, and a Royal Boxing Day shoot in 2017. And I do think, just going back to the Meghan Markle angle, it feels as if she is very much into animal conservationism and is a huge animal rights activist, and it does feel to some extent as though they're both sort of moving away from the royal label and the royal sticker more generally, and hunting is seen as a sort of royal pastime. So it does seem that they're sort of moving towards a new brand, and that perhaps hunting won't really fit. But I do think, just to go back to the point that Holden very briefly remarked on, this idea that the coverage of this story is really quite something. I mean, the Times headline was "Meghan will stop Prince Harry hunting," Jane Goodall says. The idea that, he is just so beholden to her and so enthralled or so under her spell or whatever it is, all the kind of absurd or nasty depictions of her, that she has sort of issued this decree and he will no longer be doing it, is really quite fascinating, I think.
And even if it's true, Arion, that, it's Camp Meghan who's put this edict down, that is clearly a huge and successful profligate team of PR people and brand managers who possibly understand better what the young royals should be saying and doing in the Instagram age than the actual royal PR team do in this country.
It feels as though this generation of royals has been moving away from a whole lot of different behaviours of previous generations, and a lot of that is now being put on their wives, and particularly Meghan, now that she is so much in the firing line, particularly of the British tabloids. But I think that you could see how both of the younger royal princes, Harry and William, their own activities seem to be more aligned with progressive causes like conservationism. And so you could understand how, in fact, it's probably something that is being equally led by their own instincts and impulses as well as those of their partners. So it does seem to be, particularly when it's just a throwaway remark from Jane Goodall saying, I think it's because of Meghan. It does seem to be insufficient evidence for making that claim.
I think it reflects a change in the conservation movement itself, which in many cases has actually grown out of the hunting movement. Like the earliest game reserves in Africa were set up by people who were, the reason they wanted to conserve the animals was so they could shoot them. And there has been a kind of long and slow and still incomplete process of changing from the idea of going out into these game reserves to kill animals to going out to see them and enjoy being in their presence in their natural environment. But opinion is still actually divided, and you have some charities like Born Free which are absolutely against any kind of hunting, and particularly trophy hunting, whereas on the other side you have the World Wildlife Fund, who have argued that trophy hunting can actually play a part in raising money for conservation and attaching a value to the live animals. If you sort of nominate certain animals, even endangered species, where there may be an elderly animal that's no longer reproductive. There was a case in Namibia where a black rhino, which is very endangered, had a hunting license sold for about $350,000, and that money was then put into anti-poaching operations. This was hugely controversial, and you can see immediately why there's a sort of cognitive dissonance about that. But their argument, supported by people like the World Wildlife Fund, is that you do more good than harm with these sorts of operations.
Yeah, I'm now wondering whether it was the black rhino who bought the lyrics to Hey Jude. But I guess there's also the mitigation of animal-human conflict to think about here too, isn't there, Felicity? If Prince Harry's words are so important that it actually leads to a diminishing of hunting participants, that could lead to an increase of humans getting gouged by wild animals. I mean, the animals have to be killed somehow. At the moment, that's being done for sport. But I mean, people who live there would say, well, I'll go and kill it anyway because it's going to kill me otherwise.
I suppose so. I think that's the other thing. It's the kind of the preaching of not just the royals, but a preaching of Western societies to parts of the world where, once you're on the ground and you're working with people who know the locals and know the landscape and know what's going on, it's quite unfortunate for people who really know very little to start dictating what is best and what is right for one area or the other. But I mean, it's just such an emotive topic more than anything. I think a lot of the logic and reason kind of gets brushed to one side because people see pictures of butchered animals and hunters looking very triumphant, and it really, pulls on the heartstrings.
Holden.
I think the other issue that hunting has, which is particularly relevant in this case, is that it's seen as posh and aristocratic. And in the UK specifically, we don't really have much of a cultural sense of hunters as people who are going out to collect their own food in the way that you might get in parts of the US or possibly even Australia. Whereas here it's definitely seen as an aristocratic pursuit. And you think about fox hunting in particular, and then perhaps, shooting parties going out after pheasant or grouse. And that perhaps is exactly the image that the younger royals are trying to distance themselves from.
Yeah, well, we wouldn't want the royal family to be seen as posh and aristocratic. That is it for another majestic edition of The Week Unwrapped. Don't shoot us down. My thanks to Arion, Felicity, and to Holden. Remember, you can hunt down The Week Unwrapped's entire back catalogue right now. Just search for The Week Unwrapped using your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producer, Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.